Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Crystal Chumney, and I'm the Manager of Public Services here at New Canaan Library. We are delighted to have Dr. Gil Harel join us this evening for the second installment of his Music and Nationalism in the 19th Century program this month. This evening, he will focus on music in Italy. Dr. Gil Harel is a musicologist and music theorist whose primary research focuses on vocal music. He currently serves on the faculty of Naugatuck Valley Community College and has taught at various institutions, including Baruch College, Brandeis University, and the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics in Chengdu, China. Off campus, Dr. Harel maintains an active schedule as a performer and speaker at academic as well as community events, where he lectures on subjects ranging from Renaissance, madrigals, to atonal opera. His pedagogical style has won him many accolades, including CUNY's most prestigious teaching award, the coveted Presidential Excellence Award. At this time, please silence your cell phones. Cell phones. Please join me in giving Dr. Harel another warm welcome.
Check, microphone test, wonderful. Welcome, folks. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me this evening. Thank you to Crystal. Thank you to the library for hosting me. And thank you all for making it out on this rainy Thursday evening. Tonight, we resume our discussion of music and nationalism in the 19th century. As you'll recall, last week, we spent our evening talking about music in the German-speaking lands, by which we were referring to Germany and Austria. We talked about the contributions of composers such as Schubert and Mendelssohn and Brahms. And we culminate our discussion with discussion of the somewhat controversial and polarizing composer Richard Wagner, whose operas, most notably Tristan and Isolde, seem to establish a new type of sound in the European soundscape of the 19th century, a sound characterized by dissonance, a sound characterized by wandering tonality, which takes a long time to establish itself. And some would argue that in the case of the prelude to Tristan and Isolde, it doesn't even ever really establish itself. And musicologists and music theorists today still debate what key Tristan and Isolde begins in. Is it A minor? Is that a double appoggiatura chord? What's going on in that prelude? Well, we talked about how Wagner's influences were numerous, but one thing that we seized on, which was interesting, was Wagner's fascination with philosophy, namely the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, which in the 1850s, Wagner was drinking very deeply from the chalice of Schopenhauer, and especially one of his seminal works, The World as Will and Representation, Die Welt als Wille und Vorstellung. And we said that perhaps the reason that Wagner's music comes off to the listener as so nebulous, so murky in its tonality is because Wagner was attempting to suffuse the music with a sort of philosophical quality. And in the case of Tristan und Isolde, we talked about what that philosophical Endweg, that sort of goal of the music is. And that is to establish something which is, by its very nature, extremely abstract, the concept of human desire. Whether we call it physical desire, we could call it lust, or we could call it, perhaps Wagner and his defenders might have argued that it was something more noble than simply lust. Nonetheless, Wagner is trying to capture something in music which is very abstract. And so we talked about that infamous Tristan chord, that harmony which begins the piece and manifests throughout the opera and really does not resolve until the very end. Today we turn our gaze to Italy. And so we're going to go back all the way to the early Baroque period, approximately the year 1600, and we're going to get a crash course on the history of opera. Because to know opera is, on some level, to know the history of Italian music. Italy was, of course, ground zero for many important things in the 16th century. One could speak for hours about the Renaissance. But what I'd like to focus on is what happened at the end of the Renaissance, specifically what was happening in the city of Firenze, better known to us English speakers as Florence. Florence. Yes. Well, Florence was an important city at the end of the Renaissance for music. There was a group of musicians, which included, by the way, a man by the name of Vincenzo Galilei, father of Galileo, who was a very gifted musician, a singer and a lutenist. That's a word we don't use very often, right? A lutenist. At any rate, this group of musicians came to be known as the Florentine Camerata, meaning or suggesting that they worked in close quarters and that they exchanged ideas on art and music and aesthetics and what was beautiful about sharing music. And out of the Florentine Camerata, we get this idea that solo singing should have more primacy in music. The Renaissance, you see, had been all about group singing, masses, motets, madrigals, contrapuntal pieces where 4 to 6 people on average are singing and everybody's got an independent line. If you've ever been in a choir and you've tried to sing one on a part in a Renaissance piece, you know how difficult it is because you really have to have an iron sense of your own line and you can't sort of lean on the other parts. Out of Florence in the late 16th century comes this idea that perhaps we, that is to say musicians of the late 16th century, should be focusing more on soloists. Let individual singers embellish and ornament their singing so as to showcase the capability of their individual voices. And out of this, we get a distinctly Italian creation, and of course, it's opera. Perhaps one of the first great opera composers is none other than Claudio Monteverdi. Monteverdi, again, if you lived in Boston, maybe you'd have more opportunities to go hear Monteverdi's operas. It's not common for his operas to be done in a place like New York, or at least not in the big venues, because, of course, Monteverdi didn't stage his operas in big, huge venues, so people try to be authentic to the period. Nonetheless, I think most people, most commentators, most scholars, and certainly most history textbooks would tell you that Italian opera really gets its start with Claudio Monteverdi, perhaps Orfeo, this is first decade of the 17th century. Later on, he would write the Coronation of Poppea. And later in the century, you have English composers who try to kind of wedge their way into the opera world, most famously Henry Purcell, who wrote Dido and Aeneas in the 1670s, for those who know that work. But I would suggest that for 150 years or more, from 1600 to at least 1750, despite other composers trying to make a mark in the world of opera, opera was a distinctly Italian idiom. And I think this point is elegantly summed up in the movie Amadeus, for those who have seen that movie. There's a moment early on in the film where the Emperor of Austria wants to bring Mozart to Vienna. And he says to his sort of chamber of advisors, he says, well, perhaps we can tempt him here with an opera. What language should it be in? And immediately his advisors, who have names like Antonio Salieri and Giuseppe Bono, they immediately say, oh, Your Majesty, it should be Italian, it should be Italian. And one of them, the Baron von Swieten, says, what about German? And it falls on the Kapellmeister, Giuseppe Bono, in the film. He says, Scusate, Your Majesty, ma German is, come si dice, it's too brutta for singing. Too brutta means too ugly. Now, last week we talked about Wagner, and we talked about how Wagner was a champion of all things German. In fact, some of you may know Wagner rejected the label opera. Yeah, that's right. If you had asked Wagner in the 1870s, what have you spent your whole life working on, he would not have replied opera. He would have used the German term Musikdrama, music dramas. And if you had said to him, but aren't they really operas? He probably would have put up a fight and said absolutely not. And in a text called Art and Revolution, and another text called Oper als Drama, Opera as Drama, he talks about how his works are different from the Italians. You see, he rejects the word opera because, well, it's an Italian word. And for Wagner, he's trying to break away from the Italian tradition. I think before we move on to Verdi, we should talk about two composers who warrant special mention in the development of opera in the late classical period. The first is Mozart, right? Mozart, essentially, I think most opera lovers would agree that Mozart basically perfects the classical Italian operatic idiom. That is to say, he takes the works of composers like Salieri and lesser composers and somehow takes all of the principles, they coalesce into perfect dramas for him. They have just the right balance of comedy, just the right balance of poignant romance. The bad guy gets the comeuppance, right? Both, for example, at the end of Don Giovanni, where the title character is dragged to hell by the avenging spirit of the Commendatore, and also in, for example, Le Nozze di Figaro, in The Marriage of Figaro, where the Count is embarrassed, humiliated, and basically begs forgiveness at the end of the opera. But Mozart also had a hand in developing German opera, didn't he? First in the early 1780s with Die Entführung aus dem Serail, which we say the abduction from the Seraglio. And then in 1791, September 1791, the premiere of an opera which is a crowd pleaser and maybe a nightmare for sopranos who are aspiring to this particular role of the Queen of the Night. And of course, I'm talking about Die Zauberflöte, better known as the Magic Flute. Later on, in the early 19th century, there's another composer who makes a contribution to German opera, and that work is called Fidelio. And that composer was Beethoven. Let me say one thing, or perhaps two things, about Fidelio before we move on. Beethoven clearly was committed to writing opera at first. There's a great biography, by the way, that just came out a few years ago by Jan Swafford. It's all about Beethoven. And he goes into detail about Beethoven's correspondences with various people, from publishers to performers to impresarios. And what we glean from that is that Beethoven was never really happy with Fidelio. It drove him kind of nuts in a way. Frustration, wanting to change things. Those of you who know the overture to Fidelio, you know that there are several overtures. We call them sometimes the Leonora overtures. Why? Because Beethoven couldn't even decide what kind of overture he wanted for the opera. That's how much trouble it gave him. And if we take the total sort of diachronic window of time between when he started working on it, when he put the kind of last touches on the opera, we're talking about over a decade and a half of work went into this. And that's just one opera, and that was his only opera. Nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that by the 19th century, with all of the nationalism that's bristling in many composers, Wagner represents the German style. And we began today, and we talked last week so much about how he wanted to break away from the Italians. Today, we're going to talk about exactly what that means. What does it mean to write opera which is sort of anti-Italian in its idiomatic flavor? Well, we're going to talk about that right now. There were important Italian operatic composers in the early 19th century. Gaetano Donizetti, of course, Vincenzo Bellini, both of whom died very young, by the way. And in fact, if you went back to, say, the year 1820, most historians agree that if you were to take a poll and ask the average European, continental European at least, who their favorite composer was in 1820, odds are, even though he was still alive, the answer was not Beethoven. The answer for most people, scholars think, was Rossini, of all people. Barber of Seville fame, right? I think it's fair to say that the 19th century constitutes a golden age for Italian opera. And a lot of that has to do not only with the figures we just mentioned, but with a man whose name is on the screen right now, and that says Victor Borga famously called him Joe Green. Right? Giuseppe is Joseph, Verdi. So what was it about this Joe Green fella? Well, let me say a few things about Verdi. Number one, in a century where composers seem to drop dead at very young ages, let me give you a couple of examples of that. Franz Schubert dies at 31. Felix Mendelssohn dies at 38. Chopin dies at 39. Robert Schumann made it to the ripe old age of 46. We have a long sort of list of composers who die young. And then there's Verdi. Verdi's born in the early part of the second decade of the 19th century, and he lives until 1901. So 1813 to 1901. So nearly 90 years old. And what's remarkable about his career is that he's active as a composer really into his 70s. We have Otello, which was written when he was in his late 60s, and then Falstaff in his 70s. So Verdi is not only one of the best-known composers, but also, I think it's fair to say, one of the most prolific operatic composers in history. He's in that category with people like Mozart, people like Wagner, who just have long lists of operas, some of which even diehard opera fans perhaps have heard of, but couldn't whistle an aria from it, and I'm guilty of that too. There are Verdi operas which I tell myself I'm going to get around to really familiarizing myself with this one day. Still waiting to get around to Macbeth, you know, but I have some great anecdotes I could tell you about going to see operas when I was a kid, but we'll leave that for another day. I was very lucky that my grandparents took me, and I think catalyzed this spark which instilled in me a deep appreciation of what happens in opera. But it was La Traviata that I think really brought me into this world, and so that's the opera I've chosen to talk about. I also think it's fair to say that La Traviata, if you had to choose one opera that represents sort of a cross-section of Verdi's gifts as a master of opera, this is a good one to look at. It's written in 1853, so Verdi is 40 years old when this opera is written and premiered. This was a very busy time for the guy. In the span of 3 years, he had written Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, and then in 1853, La Traviata. So 3 operas which form the cornerstone for any opera company or any opera house in the world, or at least in the Western world, and they were written back to back to back. So you want to talk about a guy who had a prodigious work ethic, and again, we're talking about someone whose career spanned nearly half a century, so you can imagine just how prolific Verdi was. There's a lot of things we could say about La Traviata, but let's focus on the characters, because that's really, I think, where Verdi succeeds so much. Whereas Wagner's characters sometimes come across as a bit cartoonish, don't they? Whether it's Siegfried in the Ring Cycle, in the second half of the Ring Cycle, or Wotan, who seems to stand there with his spear and proclaim things, or Brunhilde, or certainly in Tristan and Isolde, as we talked about the Liebestod last week, where Isolde is kind of smiling through the last 30 minutes of the opera when her lover is dead, and she's got this big transcendent grin on her face, singing about the enveloping, wafting airs of the world breath, and this complicated language which Wagner himself wrote. Remember, Wagner wrote his own libretti. Italian opera, by comparison, is much more straightforward. It's much more immediate in a way. It's meant to appeal to us as listeners, first and foremost, by giving us great melodies. Verdi was a tremendous melodist. He knew how to write tunes that were just the right combination of conjunct line. Conjunct line means something that sort of is very singable with notes which are right next to each other, but also giving the singers an opportunity to embellish and ornament in this style which harkens back to the early 19th century in what's called the bel canto tradition. Bel canto means just what it sounds like, right? Beautiful singing. But it's what's implied in that designation which is important for us. If beautiful singing is the focus, then that means that to some degree at least, you know what's not the focus? Complex orchestration with 200 musicians in the pit. Philosophical themes which have to be articulated through nebulous harmonies which don't resolve. Do you see what I mean? So that's what we're getting at when we talk about Italian opera being much more direct. And I think it's fair to say that Verdi had a great gift for forging melodies which could immediately be communicated to the listener, so much so that it was expected that when you went to hear an opera, that you'd leave that hall humming, whistling, perhaps even singing. There's a great story about the opera Rigoletto, which is 2 years prior to Traviata. And the story goes that when Verdi wrote the famous aria towards the end, La Donna Immobile, that he wrote this melody, and he must have known that it was a great tune, just that, a great tune, very catchy, that when he was teaching it to the tenor who was performing at the premiere in the 1850s, he basically said to him, "Don't you dare sing so much as a fragment of this melody unless you're in a closed practice room." Because Verdi was worried that had this tenor been strolling around town in Milan or anywhere else and humming this tune, what would have happened? The cat would have been out of the bag. The people of Milan would have heard the tune, and then when they hear it during the opera, oh, I know this, right? It doesn't have that amazing. It's hard for us today to conjure up exactly what an audience reaction was like back then. But I think one thing that we can say, and scholars are almost in unanimous agreement about this, is that the way we interact with opera today And the way that we interact with individual performers is pretty staid compared to what it was like 150 years ago. 150 years ago, and I don't mean this to be too hyperbolic, I think it's fair to say that an opera had the possibility, depending on how successful that premiere was, to have the ambiance and capture the mood of a world wrestling entertainment event. People would go berserk, and I mean that in a good way. Not, Stravinsky at the Rite of Spring premiere in 1913 berserk. That's a different concert berserk. Today, we tend to treat the concert hall as this place of hushed meditation, almost like a temple, right? Almost like a sanctuary of silence. But the evidence suggests that 150 years ago, audiences interacted to some degree. They would call out during arias. If a singer went up to an especially impressive note, they might call out and cheer and burst into applause in the middle. They might demand encores in the middle of the piece. These are things which to a modern audience they seem so peculiar at least, and bizarre, perhaps if you really think about it. It's so different from what we are used to. And yet, again, scholarship is more or less in unanimous agreement that this is what a concert was like. If you were in Lucca or in Milan or in Rome in the 1850s and you went to see a Verdi piece, it was something special. And of course, as we said, La Traviata, I think, encapsulates just how amazing one fairly simple drama can be when you distill what's on stage down to great singing, great character development, and a very poignant ending. We know that Italian opera, and opera in general, tends to be pretty tragic in nature in the 19th century, which means that if you're singing soprano, you're probably going to die at the end of the opera. Sorry, sopranos. And such is the case in La Traviata. This is really a drama of two characters, Alfredo and Violetta. Alfredo is our tenor, as most of the main characters in Verdi dramas are tenors, but not all. And Alfredo, well, God help him, he's kind of a simple guy in a way. He's sort of a square, to be honest. And so what Verdi does is he gives him pretty square-sounding music, very accessible, very immediate. For example, in Act 1, you'll hear Alfredo sing his aria Un di Felice, and the harmony couldn't be more simple. Now, compare that to last week. Remember, we looked at Tristan and Isolde, and we said, okay, what's going on here? And we sit there asking ourselves, what kind of music is this? What chord is that? Well, with Verdi, we don't have to guess. Hey, it's F major. Un di felice, papa, ma di. And in this case, the orchestra sort of functions as a giant acoustic guitar, sort of gently strumming chords and providing the harmonic underpinning so that the singer will be the focus. I think it's fair to say that if we think about it from that angle, this style of opera is antithetical to the German style. And it's not just Wagner. There are other composers we could mention. Carl Maria von Weber, if you know the opera Der Freischütz, which is earlier. Wagner was a teen when that opera was premiered, 1820s. And in Der Freischütz, you get also this infamous harmonically. It's a very famous scene, I should say. But the music is quite nebulous, and so therefore it's a scene that gets a lot of attention. The famous Wolf's Glen scene when they're forging the magic bullets under the direction of Zamiel, the devil. And the music is so hard to puzzle out at times. It seems to just sort of float there in this ethereal way, and Verdi's giving us the opposite. Verdi's giving us a tune we can go home and sing if we want, right? And Alfredo's music, I think, most of the opera is very direct. But his counterpart in the opera, she's a bit more flighty, you might say. She's got a little bit more spunk, a little bit more fire in her blood, you might say. And that's Violetta. And she is the eponymous Traviata. La Traviata is difficult to translate. It's usually rendered in English as the fallen woman, or sometimes the woman gone astray. I had a colleague in graduate school, Michela Zaccanini, and I said, Michela, what exactly does La Traviata mean? And he looked at me and said, oh, La Traviata. It's like, ¿cómo se dice? It's like, you don't have this word in English. And I think that's one of the things we encounter here is that it's just, you wouldn't bother translating this. Like, for example, if you talk about the ring cycle, people might prefer to say Twilight of the Gods. Because if you want to say it in German, how does one say Twilight of the Gods in German? Die Götterdämmerung. Well, we got 2 umlauts in that word. That's a long one. So you might say Twilight of the Gods, but with Italian opera, we almost exclusively, nobody would be really weird to say, you know what, last Saturday night I saw The Woman Gone Astray. It was great. No, doesn't happen. However, La Traviata. So we have Violetta. She's the woman gone astray. She's a courtesan. And she prizes this lifestyle, this carefree lifestyle where one can socialize and fraternize with the upper echelon of Parisian society, enjoy the nightlife. She enjoys all of the adulation and attention she gets. And so early on in the opera, Alfredo makes it clear. He says, I knew it was love when I saw you on that ethereal day. And then he sings, Misterioso, love is so mysterious. Misterioso e altero, croce delizia al cor. He says, it's the delicious torment in life. And she says to him, she answers back, she says, hey, wait a second, buddy. If that's what you're looking for, you got to look elsewhere. All I can offer you is friendship. And what happens is Verdi gives Alfredo very simple music. Bum, bum, ba, bum, bum, ba, 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 bum. And when Violetta starts singing, she's like, ba, 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 bum, bum, ba, ba, dum, ba, 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 bum, bum, ba, bum, bum, ba, ba, 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 bum, 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 bum. In other words, Verdi's kind of characterizing these 2 figures. He's telling us what they're all about, everything we need to know about them. Alfredo is earnest, he's direct, he's straightforward, he's a bit simple in a way. Violetta's a more nuanced character, I think it's fair to say. And so her music reflects that. We're going to see that in just a moment when we listen to the aria that ends Act 1, Sempre Libera, when she finally decides, you know what, I can't be with him, I need to be free. Before we listen, let me give you some context about how the opera progresses. And many of you know the libretto, so I won't spend too much time on it, but I will say a few things. This is a tragic opera, so Violetta is going to die at the end in the 3rd act. And she dies of what in opera was a very convenient catch-all malady that could be used to kill any character at any time, and that's consumption. Very convenient. If you're writing an opera, you're a librettist. In this case, Francesco Maria Piave, he didn't create the story. The story was actually written by the son of Alexandre Dumas, so the second Alexandre Dumas fille. And it was based on a French play, which is sometimes translated into English simply as Camille. Anyway, Piave arranged the libretto. Verdi sets it to music. And Violetta's going to die at the end, but of course not before she sings Addio del Passato, right? She has to sing this beautiful one last aria. And I'll tell you one story about that before we listen. I went to a conference in an AMS, American Musicological Society conference. More exciting than it sounds. And this was in this opera premieres 1853. So this was in 2015. So in 2015, what are scholars talking about now, 165 years later? Well, this is what you'd think musicology has sort of combed over these pieces. What's left to say? Well, there was a scholar there. I think he taught at Swarthmore College, and his argument, his paper that he presented was called Tubercular Singing in 19th Century Opera. And he argued in this paper that he presented that when Violetta sings this, she should sing like, Addio del Passato. You should sing it. How could you possibly sing it beautifully if you've got tuberculosis? You should be coughing and wheezing and hacking your way through the aria. And someone raised a hand very sort of timidly and said, Professor, what about suspension of disbelief? Can't we just enjoy the aria? Why do we have to have her hack and wheeze her way through it? At any rate, this is a production featuring Anna Netrebko as Violetta. And I'm going to do theater mode so we could see the subtitles because we had that last week. And so what you'll see here is this is a short, what they call cabaletta. Cabaletta is a sort of fast-paced aria often used to end the act so the soprano can dash off screen. behind the curtain as the music is reaching its climax. I think Netrebko is very good in this production. I think the staging is a bit bizarre. If you're looking at the stage and wondering, is this like a Stanley Kubrick? Is this a Peter Sellers thing? Who did this? Well, as you can see, the staging is basically a blank. It's supposed to be the Parisian nightlife is where it's supposed to be set, and instead we get this blank, vacant set with this bleached white, very austere presentation, and a bright red leather couch in the middle. And then, of course, there is this gigantic clock on the wall, and the clock, of course, is a symbol of how Violetta's time is ticking to a close. So here is Sempre Libera from the end of Act 1. And you'll hear, by the way, and even see Rolando Villazon as Alfredo in this production. He's sort of singing off stage, just sort of musing about how love is so mysterious and old and delightfully painful. And that's Alfredo for you, wandering around singing slowly to himself about the delights of love and how deliciously painful. I love that in Italian, croce delizia. You know, it's lovely language. And that's Francesco Maria Piave who did the libretto. So here is the end of Act 1. There's the Reaper. Can you sense these things we talked about musical characterization of the person who's singing? Compare this aria to the Liebestod, to the end of Tristan, where the orchestra is blaring and the harmony is swirling and coalescing and leading in all different directions before veering off in new and unanticipated ways. Here, the harmony is very predictable. And there's something very satisfying about that, isn't there? We talked about this last week, right? We talked about the concept of tonality, how tonality gives us this clear sense of direction that leads us from one note to another. And in Verdi, the tonality is almost always very clear. Perhaps in the very end of his career, I think Otello has some very bold music in it. But for the most part, the music is very straightforward. The orchestra here is just doing pop 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 pop. And did you notice that for a long stretch the orchestra cut out completely? That doesn't happen in Wagner. See, the orchestra is often too busy playing some leitmotif or otherwise articulating some philosophical concept. But Verdi is not interested in that because he's really a man of the theater, a man who understands what people want. And I think for that reason, if you were to look around at any opera database that tracks performances around the world, I don't think there's a single opera company in the Western world that could survive without Verdi's repertoire. It forms a cornerstone for any opera company, any opera house, and certainly for any aspiring opera singer, you would learn arias by Verdi. It's this sense of musical characterization, I think, which imbues and suffuses Italian opera with this very compelling, almost addictive quality, because we can really feel ourselves integrated into the drama. We can understand these characters, what their mental state is, what their desires are, what their fears and anxieties are. I think it's very hard to say that about Wagner. What does Brunhilde feel when she wakes up on the top of the mountain surrounded by enchanted fire at the end of Siegfried? A person can't relate to that. It's very hard to get inside that psychological state, isn't it? But Alfredo and Violetta, this is real life. We could understand them. And I think that makes a perfect segue and brings us into our next composer and the last composer for today, and that's Giacomo Puccini. Puccini might be thought of as the successor in many ways to Verdi. He carries Italian opera in the Romantic style into the 20th century. Puccini died in the early 1920s. Unfortunately, he was a very avid cigar smoker and died of throat cancer. And Puccini was perhaps not as prolific as Verdi was. Gesundheit. Or should I say salud. But he did have a very productive streak in the late 19th century and across into the 20th century. And there are really three operas, I think, that weren't mentioned. I'm just going to be talking about one of them. But we should talk about La Bohème. La Bohème, which that could have been the piece we talked about tonight very easily. We could have talked about the enchanting duet from the end of the third act. I mean, you want to talk about duets. It's hard to pick one that captures this sense of wistful longing and resignation and deep admiration and love the way that that does. Puccini really understood, I think, the nature of intimacy and of romantic relationships, and that's something that shines in his operas. Whereas, once again, to use Wagner, Tristan and Isolde are hard. It's hard to relate to them. It's hard to get inside what could drive a person to embrace the choices that they embrace. On the other hand, in Puccini operas, it's very easy to relate to these characters, much like we saw with Verdi. And we see that in Bohème. We see it in his opera from 1900, Tosca. And I think we see it most brilliantly, perhaps, in his 1904 opera, Madame Butterfly. And that's the opera I've chosen to speak about. Butterfly is an interesting example of what we might call a kind of verismo opera. Verismo in the sense that it's gritty and realistic, and it's meant to capture the Zeitgeist, if I can borrow a German term there. That is to say, the spirit of a given period in a given location. And the location here is very exotic because we're not in Paris, which was a very common setting. We saw that in Traviata. We also see it in Bohème. It's not anywhere in Italy. Those of you who know Tosca know it's set in Rome. Here we're set, of all places, in Nagasaki. So we have this opera, which is written, set to music by an Italian composer. Actually, the story is from an American, John Luther Long. Set by an Italian composer and set in Japan. So we have this interesting triangle relationship here. One of my students said, isn't that sort of like an opera version of the Super Mario Brothers? Well, wait a second. What does that mean? Okay, Super Mario Bros. Created in Japan for a North American audience and featuring an Italian plumber. Okay, I see it, yeah. Okay, I'm connecting the dots of the triangle right now, yeah. But what's really wonderful about this is it gives Puccini an opportunity to embrace what might be thought of as an exotic Oriental sound. And what that means for musicians, some of you may be familiar with concepts like the pentatonic scale. Pentatonic scale is just what it sounds like. It's a scale with 5 notes. And it tends to have this quality. Many people immediately are able to identify it because it has a very characteristic sound. Stravinsky uses it towards the end of the Augurs of Spring, where you have this sort of sound. And it's not just a stock device that composers use. When I was in China, my wife and I went to see Sichuan opera, and guess what we heard? Lots and lots of pentatonic scales. And there's something wonderful about pentatonic music. It sounds open. It has a shimmering quality to it, perhaps we might say. Nonetheless, by setting an opera that's where the drama is unfolding in Nagasaki, Puccini is able to kind of muster an exotic collection of notes for some scenes, not for every scene, but famously in the ending, for those of you who know how it ends, it has this wonderful, I don't know. And it ends on that very mysterious chord, that G major chord there, where it feels like it should be B minor for you music theory fans out there. The end of the opera feels for all the world like it's headed to B minor, and then we get this thunderous G major chord, cut, and it's wonderful. The story of this opera is based in Nagasaki, and it involves an American naval officer by the name of B.F. Pinkerton. Now, Puccini he takes certain measures to make sure that the audience, remember it's an Italian audience, right? So you have to take certain measures to reinforce the American identity of Pinkerton. So he has the name B.F. Pinkerton, which stands for Benjamin Franklin Pinkerton. He sails on a ship that's called the USS Abraham Lincoln. And, of course, when we really start to first get into his music, he's introduced with a theme I think you'll all find very familiar. Another thing about Pinkerton is that he's not a very good he's not a good guy. It's not a very flattering depiction of Americans, to be honest. Pinkerton is, I wouldn't say he's malicious or anything like that, but he's overwhelmingly egotistical, he's selfish, and he's a character who doesn't weigh the consequences of his actions, and that's going to be what drives the drama here. And in a way, that's a lot more satisfying than some mustache-twirling villain, isn't it? Having a character like, oh, I don't know, just to choose one example. For me, sometimes I think that Don Giovanni is a frustrating character because he's just so kind of one-dimensional in a way. Everything he does is ethically and morally wrong. And Pinkerton's not so black and white. He's more shades of gray, you might say. He's a character who, he doesn't, on the surface, nothing about him is malicious, and yet through his negligence, through his sins of omission, as well as commission, his actions lead to the very tragic fate of the title character, the Madame Butterfly, whose name in the opera is Cho-Cho-san. So we're going to pick up in Act 1, and we're going to watch a film adaptation that was done in 1995 with François Mitterrand directing, and Richard Troxell singing the role of, Richard Troxell is singing the role of B.F. Pinkerton. Remember, he sails on the SS Abraham Lincoln. So if you weren't sure what his nationality is, you will be in a moment. Here we're introduced to the character of Sharples, who is the baritone counterpart to Pinkerton. He's the other American living in Nagasaki. And the story is basically centered around this central idea. Pinkerton is a naval figure. He's very powerful. He's an officer, and he's stationed in Nagasaki. And in his first aria, he sings about how important it is for him to sample all the local delights when he's stationed in a new exotic location. And he says, if I can't go around and pick a flower and kiss a girl on every shore, then life's not worth living. And Sharples is a bit more jaded, you see. And so his reaction is, well, that's a very easy, convenient lifestyle to embrace, but is it practical is what he's implying. Ultimately, we're going to see Pinkerton's character evolve a little bit, but he's going to disappear after the first act, and he doesn't come back until the third act. So really the end of the second act is when his ship arrives back in port. So we're going to watch this scene, and then we'll watch another scene from the beginning of Act 2. Here is Richard Troxell singing Dovunque al mondo from the beginning of Madame Butterfly. And in this case, you'll see that Sharples has just arrived. Pinkerton is bragging about how he's just leased a new house in Nagasaki, and he's leased it for 999 years. But as he points out, in Japan, you can break a lease whenever you want, so, no big deal. And he's going to apply the same logic to his marriage because, you see, he's gone through this creepy marriage broker, Goro, the guy on the right here. And Goro has brokered this marriage. And Sharples said, what's the deal? Are you really getting married, Pinkerton? And Pinkerton says, yes, in Japan, a marriage contract lasts for 999 years. But I can back out anytime I want to, right? So we get a foreshadowing of where the drama is headed. And once again, the music tells so much of the story. If you were wondering who Pinkerton is or what he's about, the music will tell you. I want to say one more thing before I hit play. Puccini, it's hard to try to crystallize exactly what it is about his music that makes it so special. But if I had to, and this comes through years of studying the scores, I would say it's this. Puccini crafts a vocal climax like nobody else. And this is to some degree a little bit arcane, a little esoteric. But what I mean by it is that when Puccini gives us a high note, gosh darn it, that high note really matters. And it really rings. He's not going to double it up. He's not going to make you hear it once so that when the climax comes, you've already heard that note. He's going to be very careful. It's a subconscious thing, but I think most listeners can appreciate that when that high note hits, you feel that sensation. The hair on the back of your neck stands up, and you realize that something very special has just occurred. So here we go.
È una casetta che obbedisce a bacchetta. Costa? La comperai per 999 anni. Con facoltà ogni mese di rescindere i patti. Sono in questo paese elastici del far case contratte. E l'uomo esperto ne profitta. Certo.
Where's Pinkerton from?
Si gode, traffica, sprezza
we're going to resume in just a moment. One thing you'll find when you watch Puccini's operas is that he embraces this kind of Wagnerian idea. Wagner did away with what's called recitative, this idea that there should be pauses between the different arias of the opera, and the dialogue will come out in a kind of sung, half-spoken manner. And Wagner coined this term, which he calls unendliche Melodie. Und was bedeutet unendliche Melodie auf English? Unending melody. In other words, a style of music where we go from one aria to the next without these kind of very contrived breaks. And so we go right from this aria into the next one, Amore o Grillo. Well, we hear the Star-Spangled Banner. We hear how Pinkertons climax on America Forever. There's actually two lines of English in this aria. The first is when he says to Sharples, milk punch or whiskey, right? Milk punch or whiskey. And then when he goes up to that high B flat, it's right as the tune, the theme from the Star-Spangled Banner is coming back. So it's very powerful. He goes up to that high note, and it's clear that from there we're moving on to the next, really it's the next aria. And in this one, Sharples attempts to address Pinkerton's sort of very flighty attitude, his very chimerical behavior. He says, are you really getting married, or what's the story? And what Pinkerton says is sort of indicative of what kind of person he is. He says, I have no idea. It could be love, or it could be a passing fancy, but I'm going to pursue it anyway, even if it means snapping her wings off. The butterfly, right? That's the eponymous butterfly. So let's go ahead and listen to that now.
Ghirlanda di fiori freschi.
What I say about those climaxes, right? When those high notes ring, they matter. And that's something that I think with Wagner, especially for the tenor parts in Wagner, the soprano roles are a little bit different, but Wagner coined this term Heldentenor, the heroic tenor. And there are a lot of professional tenors whose careers are cut short. I mean, we don't know for sure, but a lot of scholars and people who study the anatomy of voice think that singing Wagner is sort of unhealthy in a way because it just sits up there. And you're singing constantly between C4 and B flat 4. So you have this high tenor range where you're constantly singing for hours on end, rehearsals and then performances. And it seems when you listen to Wagner, Tristan is a good example. I've often felt this way about Tristan, even when I was an undergraduate and first began studying the piece, that the high notes seem to be sort of thrown in there in a way that is meant to demonstrate the power and heroic nature of the tenor, but it musically doesn't always fit, at least not for me as a listener. With Puccini, you don't get that. With Puccini, when you get those high notes, they make you sort of melt. They make you reach for the Kleenex, perhaps. They leave you with that feeling, that thrill, that sensation of deep appreciation of what you've just heard. We've heard Pinkerton. I think we have just enough time now to listen to a short aria that happens at the beginning of Act 2, and that's the very famous aria that Butterfly sings, Un bel dì. And in this scene, Pinkerton, they've gotten married in Act 1, and they've consummated the marriage. That's going to be an important part of the plot. But Pinkerton has left. And he's left again in that sort of casual way that he does things. And what does Butterfly do? She sits at the window staring out at the harbor every day, waiting for his ship to steam back into port. And her maid is a pragmatist. Suzuki says, basically, you're not still waiting for him, are you? And Cho-Cho-san is very adamant about it. And she sings an aria where she sort of fantasizes about this vision she has of what it's going to be like when Pinkerton returns. It's a short aria, and I think hopefully you'll indulge me and we'll listen to it. And once again, listen to how Spartan, how bare and stripped back and sort of distilled the orchestral accompaniment is. Often, even when the thunderous horns and trombones and brass instruments are playing, they're simply doubling the voice or else establishing some kind of foundation for her to float up over. They're not competing with her. One gets that sensation sometimes with Wagner. When you listen to the Liebestod, you get this sense of opposing forces, the orchestra and the voice in a kind of contrapuntal dance where they're both struggling to be heard. Here it's all about the voice. And again, a beautiful melody which is angled, is configured so that it's all heading towards the ending, which is where you get that climax, where she reinforces her resolve. And it's one of the reasons that this soprano aria is so recognizable, so iconic, and so beloved by singers and listeners alike. Notice the orchestra doubling her. We've spent, I think, some very valuable time tonight comparing and contrasting and establishing what exactly it means when we talk about Italian opera, especially in the 19th century. We've talked about the primacy of melody. We've talked about the supporting role, a decidedly ancillary role that the orchestra plays. We've talked about the relative simplicity and accessibility of plot as compared, for example, to Wagner. And it's no surprise, I think, that of the two styles, the German and the Italian style, it's the Italian style which tends to be far more popular with listeners. And when we listen to this kind of music, it's very easy to see why, right? All right, next week, we have a very special program planned. We're going to wrap up this discussion of music and nationalism in the 19th century by turning our gaze to two countries which don't get as much musicological ink, shall we say, as Italy and Germany. We're going to be looking at France, the music of Claude Debussy and the Impressionist style. And we'll be also talking about music in England, music by Edward Elgar, and if we have time, perhaps we'll look at Vaughan Williams' Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis. So we'll look at the rich history of English music, and then in the very end, we'll turn our gaze to France and talk about Impressionism and the swirling, mysterious sounds that conjure up dreams, that conjure up things which are ethereal and intangible, and what that sounds like, and why composers embrace that particular style. All that to come next week. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, folks.